Welcome to the book called Journey Outside. Shows a book on the front cover, sort of in darkness. He has sort of like a torch of some sort. He has some sort of swim shorts that sort of looks like they're either decorated with flowers or fish skin, and he's reaching. This was a Newbery Honor book, and it was one of the most interesting books I'd had read to me. Zoom in. Chapter 1. Watch out, grandfather! The old man dropped his fishbone spoon, covered his face with his hands, and cowered against the floor of the raft. Dilar sped by. The wind from his passing made the stew-pot rock unsteadily, and then he dove off the end of the raft, sending a shower of drops hissing into the fire. Grandfather scrambled up and retrieved his spoon. Be careful, Dilar, he shouted. There are Willamars about. I saw one this morning. Dilar did not answer. He swam on until he reached the next raft, hauled himself aboard. He got to his feet and ran again. It was one of the long rafts holding 4 families, and it almost gave him a chance to reach some speed. One of the women looked up and smiled as he flashed by, but most of the others, if they noticed him at all, frowned and shook their heads. Once again he went headlong into the water and swam as fast as he could out of the light of the flickering fish oil torches and into the dim interval between the rafts. It was never truly dark, for though the feeble shine from the rafts rapidly faded, the water seemed to catch and reflect light from 1,000 sources, and there was always a faint radiance over the river. In a few minutes he caught sight of the gleam of the torches of Bimar's raft ahead of him. He swam a little faster and in 10 strokes could lay his hand on the edge of the raft. He did not pull himself onto it, however. There was no need. Even at this distance he could tell that Bimar's father was in one of his black moods, and that Bimar would not be able to join him in any kind of game this time. Bimar, who was helping his father haul in a net full of fish, glanced around at Dilar. He looked unhappy. His sister was standing nearby, ready to help sort the fish into piles, those for immediate eating, those for drying, and the ones that her mother and younger brother would put between 2 stones and press to extract the oil. She held a knife for skinning the larger ones. Dilar watched them. He wondered how it would be to have a mother, a brother, and a sister. His own mother had died so long ago he could no longer remember her. His father and grandmother were all the family he'd ever had. Of course, of all the raft people, only Bimar's mother and father had 3 children. Most families had 2, and some only had 1 or none at all. There would come a time soon, Dilar's father often said, when there would only be 22 rafts instead of 23, and then perhaps 21, and then 20? Dilar gave a little shiver. Perhaps this was what put Bimar's father into his dark tempers so often lately. Dilar himself had spells when he was uneasy, when the rafts and the river and the rock-lined waterways and the fish oil torches all seemed to him to be one gray, threatening menace he did not understand, or when living seemed blank and pointless. He hated these times. It wasn't the way things were supposed to be. He saw Bimar glance at him again, and he made a sympathetic face and slipped down into the water. He pushed himself away from the raft and swam slowly against the gentle current. Mostly, he could get rid of fears and depression by playing games, by running and swimming very fast, the whole length of the flotilla. In fact, he had not this time been depressed until he saw Bimar's father, only bored. But Bimar's father's black moods always seemed to affect Dilar. Something brushed against his leg in the water, something big, and he swam faster. Were there really such things as Willamars? Grandfather was always claiming that he had seen seen a great fin above the water, or a huge tentacle stealing alongside the raft, or a big beak-like mouth opening to tear the nets and let the fish escape right into its jaws. Dilar had never seen any such thing, never, not even a shadow. But it would be rather exciting if such things did exist, he admitted to himself. It would make swimming from raft to raft an adventure. Now he walked the long raft from end to end rather than running. At the far end he slipped quietly into the water and swam to his own craft. As he grasped the edge he noticed again the outermost log was rotting, and a little piece of it came away in his fingers. Several times lately he had seen his father looking at that log in a worried fashion. He ran his hands over his fish-skin pants and swept the water from them. Grandfather didn't like to have him come near the cooking fire when he was wet. It was hard enough to keep the fire going without Diller dripping into it, he complained. When he was as dry as he could make himself, Diller sat down beside his grandfather, who handed him a bowl of fish stew. "Where is Weimar?" he asked. "Working," answered Diller. He swallowed some stew. Perhaps he should have stayed here and helped his own father instead of going to entice Weimar to race with him. But they had fish in plenty, dried and fresh, and skin bags full of oil, and a pile of torches. If his father was now busy hauling in a net full of fish, it was surely because he had nothing else to do. He ate the rest of his stew in silence, and then went to the edge of the raft and rinsed out his bowl, made of a big shell. He squatted there, watching the rough stone walls slide past and slide past and slide past. The same and the same. His eyes narrowed. That rock, the odd-shaped one with the reddish markings sticking out there? He carried his bowl back to the fire. His grandfather took it from him and stowed it in its proper place. Grandfather had a proper place for everything. Sometimes Diller teased the old man, saying that his grandfather hated mealtime, since it meant taking the bowls out of their proper places. But now Diller only watched somberly, and said nothing. "Did you see a Willamar?" asked Grandfather, after a while. He was only making conversation, Diller knew. For a few seconds he went on looking at the old man, and then he spoke. "Grandfather," he asked softly, "where are we going?" The old man busied himself feeding the fire with shreds of dried fish. "To a better place," he answered at last. "A better place than what?" insisted Diller. The old man looked agitated. "A better place than where we are now before," he said uneasily. Diller scowled. How would they know? Who remembered where they were before? Grandfather's grandfather had claimed to remember it, but he had died long before Diller was born. All that Grandfather could remember of what his grandfather had told him was something about green and something else about day. "I do not believe," said Diller slowly, "that we are going anywhere, Grandfather. I think we go around and around and around. I think we pass the same caves and the same cliffs time after time." "Hush, hush," cried the old man. What wicked things to say. It is not true. You'll see. I myself mean to live to see the better place." Diller. Diller jumped. He knew his father didn't like to have him upset Grandfather, and yet he had not truly planned to excite the old man. It had seemed to him an important thing to think about and to ask about. He had talked of it once or twice to Weimar, but the whole thing had seemed to bewilder the other boy, and Diller had given up. And who was there to ask otherwise? Not his father, who never answered questions, but just went on drawing up net after net of fish. He had a net full now. "Come and help," he called, and Diller sprang up and went to haul the net aboard the raft. There were 3 big fish and a dozen or so smaller ones caught in it. Diller's father bent quickly, with his stone knife severed their spines one by one. "We'll take these to Maimal and Lemar," he said, straightening up. Maimal and Lemar shared the raft, one of the smallest, with Diller and his father and grandfather. They were an old couple whose only child had married and gone to live on the second raft in the procession. Lemar was frail, and he often was not able to fish. Guymal, Diller's father, made a habit of taking a net full of fish to them every so often. Now, as Diller followed him past the piles of fish skins and torches, Guymal said gently, "Don't torment your grandfather. He's old, and such teasing isn't good for him." "I wasn't teasing," said Diller abruptly. "I want to know. Do you think we are headed for some better place?" Guymal did not answer. He walked on carrying the net. After Gaimel had eaten, and his bowl had been put into its proper place, the shell trumpet blew for sleep. The cooking fire was put out, and all the torches except one in the middle of the raft. Diller lay down on the pallet of dried water weeds which he made for himself. He had never liked sleeping on fish skins. But he was not sleepy. He lay watching the faint light flickering around him and hearing the water whisper and gurgle softly under his head. He was a fool. There were a dozen ways he could have found out for certain. Once he and Weimar had swum way ahead of the rafts, far out of reach of all the torches, and had climbed up on a shelf of rocks and sat there in the dimness until the rafts had come floating up. If he had made a mark on that shelf, or piled stones, or anything, he could have seen it if they ever passed that way again. Even if no one else believed him, he would have known. He would have known for certain. But he was fairly certain anyway. It was the others he wanted to convince. 1,000 marks on the wall, 1,000 piles of stones, would not make Grandfather admit they were headed for nothing and nowhere. It would take something much more than stones. The roof of the passage sloped down until, for 100 feet or so, it was so low Diller might almost have touched it with his hand if he had been standing up. How often he had seen it do this! Were there really so many low places in this long, long, winding cave that led them on and on? Wasn't it the same low place they had passed over and over again, never realizing that it was the same one? He turned restlessly, and the dry weeds rustled under him. For a long while he lay there, hearing the water and thinking. They were coming now to a narrow place in the tunnel. The water ran more swiftly and noisily. The wall on one side came so close to the raft that Diller felt sure he could simply step onto the narrow ledge, just barely visible. And then suddenly he sprang up. He seized a fishnet and a torch. Swiftly he lit the torch at the one remaining alive on the raft, ran to the edge, and jumped up onto the rim of the rock. For a moment he had to struggle for balance, but then there he was, safe on the ledge. The raft slid away from him, and there was darkness for a space, and then the following raft appeared. Diller watched it going by with the lumpy shapes of the sleeping people. It too disappeared, and then another raft slipped by, and another. Diller stared at it, clutching the torch. It glided on, silent and still, and Diller's heart thumped painfully in his chest. The raft was going by, was gone. The darkness deepened, and then nothing came to lighten it. Only shadows and the rushing of water. The last of the flotilla had drifted by, and nothing could call it back. And that is the end of Chapter 1. We'll see where Diller gets to.
Would you be willing to jump off your family's raft and hope that the raft circles around and picks you up again? Was Diller so certain that the rafts were going to circle around again? Wasn't he taking a chance? Here are previous covers for the book called Journey Outside. Each one gives hints about things that are yet to come.